turning out for this talk, and hopefully, if not necessarily the most spiritually edifying 25 minutes of your life, maybe it will at least be encouraging and interesting to you. Now, for a group, for a movement which has been home at times to a very strong theologically rooted tradition of not participating in politics, the Stone-Campbell or Restoration movement has also had a share of representation in the highest branches of the U.S. federal government. Reporting from political scientists Neil Coates and Sean Evans has shown a real rise in the prevalence and prominence of legislators affiliated with the Churches of Christ. And as some of you may know, the Disciples of Christ have produced 3 American presidents: James Garfield, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan. Now, Garfield, who is going through something of a renaissance at the moment, there was a splashy new biography last year and also an upcoming Netflix series on James Garfield, who to thunk, is the most heavily indebted to the Restoration movement. His faith, its impact on his career in politics and otherwise. There was actually an entire dissertation about this. Jerry Rushford at Pepperdine wrote his doctoral dissertation, and it was titled "The Political Disciple: The Relationship Between James A. Garfield and the Disciples of Christ." So that's more than we could cover today. So if you're interested in Garfield, watch the Netflix, read the Sunday Funnies, or read the dissertation. Now, despite the rather uncouth, sometimes coarse manner of speaking, Lyndon B. Johnson was also a longtime member of the Disciples of Christ, a regular worshiper at the National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C., and part of a multi-generational movement family, which included a member of the Christadelphians. And if you happen to want to learn more about that small group, which is an offshoot of the Restoration movement, you could always meander over to the Heritage Christian Press bookstore after this talk and find a book called Redrawing the Blueprints for the Early Church, which was written by some guy named John Young. Not sure if it's a credible source or not. And although he had already left the movement by the time he reached the White House, Ronald Reagan was raised in a home where his mother was a longtime member of the Disciples of Christ. He went to Eureka College, played football there, which was a Disciples-affiliated institution, and was a close friend of the famous singer, entertainer, and fellow political conservative Pat Boone of the Churches of Christ. Now, each of these 3 men took different influences from their Stone-Campbell or Restoration movement heritage into the Oval Office. They reached different conclusions about how to integrate their faith and their politics. But in each of these instances, the effect of the movement is apparent in the decisions and the legacies of each. But 3 other presidents also bear mentioning here, albeit for some somewhat different reasons. And although the controversial statements of the pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright Jr., led Barack Obama to break away from Trinity United Church of Christ during the 2008 election season, the president did have close ties to that congregation and to the broader tradition of the UCC. Now, the Churches of Christ and the UCC are not nearly as close in faith or practice as the names might suggest, but there is a meaningful historical link between the 2 groups if you go back far enough. Now, the united part of the UCC's name is a reference to the various mergers of streams and groups that have led to the present-day United Church of Christ. Speaking of those mergers, in 1957, so about 70 years ago, coming up on it, 3 groups, which included, among others, the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches, consolidated into the UCC. That General Council was the product of a merger a couple of decades earlier of 3 smaller groups, which included the Christian Connection. Those of you with some Restoration Movement familiarity may recognize that name, which of course was the descendants of the notable figures like Abner Jones, Elias Smith, James O'Kelly, and, most important for our purposes here, the followers of Barton W. Stone, who did not find common cause with Alexander Campbell and who did not participate in the 1832 uniting merger with those in his orbit. So we definitely have 3 Stone-Campbell presidents, right? Garfield, Johnson, Reagan. If you want to kind of stretch the borders a little bit, kind of squint at it a little bit, you can also get a 4th Stone movement president, not Campbell, but Stone movement. But there are 2 other presidents that I'm going to mention here briefly. And it doesn't give me any joy to do this, but I got to debunk some rumors. We got to play Mythbusters here for a minute. There have long been rumors about the supposed secret baptisms of a couple of our most well-known presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and that the 2 presidents would be the subjects of these kinds of rumors is understandable. I mean, these are always numbers 1 and 2 on all of the presidential rankings, right? It would be really cool if we could claim them as part of our heritage. In fact, the presidential historian Gary Scott Smith writes that, quote, like George Washington's, Lincoln's faith has been closely scrutinized, hotly debated, and often misunderstood. Both men attributed their success in war to divine providence, proclaimed days of public thanksgiving and prayer as president, rarely mentioned Jesus, and were intensely private about their personal beliefs. But another way in which these two were religiously connected is the popular perception that they underwent some sort of secret, hidden baptism that might tie them, whether directly or indirectly, to the Restoration movement. Here's the story on Washington. According to the legend, there was a Baptist chaplain named John Gano who baptized the future president during the famously trying winter at Valley Forge. Gano was, of course, the great-grandfather of Richard M. Gano, who was the famous Restoration Movement preacher, Confederate general, part of a very accomplished Restoration Movement family. Now, this story, which got its start in sworn affidavits which were given by descendants of John Gano, according to the story, the chaplain baptized Washington in front of over 40 witnesses, who were all, again, presumably sworn to secrecy as a result, because the general had some real concerns about the method, if not necessarily the motivation or the effectiveness of Episcopalian baptism, the church in which Washington remained mostly in good standing. He didn't like to take communion, but he would go pretty much every week anyways. Now, the question for us today is not whether Washington was a member of the Restoration Movement. John Gano was a Baptist chaplain. His descendants did eventually become a cornerstone family of the movement later on into the 19th century. But the question for us is, did this story take place? And while one would not want to call into question, right, the credibility of Gano's descendants, who did, for their credit, right, swear an affidavit in the courtroom that this story was true, or that they were repeating it accurately, historians have also pointed out that there are some problems with the story. Gano was not actually a chaplain, under Washington, but under George Clinton, and he was not at Valley Forge. Also, none of the 40-plus witnesses ever came forward to say anything about the tale, and Gano doesn't make any mention of the baptism in his own writings. The story is commemorated in a famous painting, which is held at William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. But even the college itself, this is, I think, somewhat telling, the college itself doesn't take a stance on whether or not the event actually took place, and that probably should indicate something to us. And in fact, this secret baptism of George Washington fits into a larger genre, shelf of stories that are mostly dubious, in which important figures from American history, and maybe people have some questions about their faithfulness, demonstrate some sort of act of piety, which, if it was true, would bring them more fully into the mainstream. And this body of stories includes a similarly apocryphal story, or actually stories, because each Christian group seems to have written its own about the supposed baptism of Abraham Lincoln. Quote, Abraham Lincoln never claimed to be a member of any church. Jim Martin writes in his 1996 debunking of this in Restoration Quarterly, but almost every denomination makes some kind of claim to him. Now, for the disciples of Christ and for the broader Stone-Campbell heritage, the story of Lincoln's supposed baptism originates from a single source, the writings of G.M. Weimer. Now, Weimer was writing in 1942 when he was 85 years old and wrote several letters and other missives during that year. If you put them all together, what Weimer claimed is that the former Illinois state evangelist, a guy named John O'Kane, had secretly immersed Lincoln in a creek near Springfield, and it was secret because Lincoln's wife didn't want him to be baptized, that she was, for some reason, not a fan of Lincoln's supposed religious conversion. And so, this story kind of changes in the telling. Eventually, at one point, he sort of is sneaking out of the house with an extra set of clothes and a towel, during the night, and kind of hiding from his wife along the way. Secret baptism. Now, Weimer was living, and Weimer was a minister within the Christian Church of Disciples of Christ. Weimer was living in Eureka, Illinois, right? Home of Eureka College. We already mentioned it with Ronald Reagan. And he was there because his sons were in college. And he said that he had a conversation with John O'Kane while his sons were in college, and that this took place at a state convention of the disciples held in that town. Right, so we have a time, we have a place, we have an occasion where these two might have overlapped. But while it would be really cool to be able to claim Lincoln as one of us, the details here just don't line up. John O'Kane, the minister that supposedly baptized Abraham Lincoln, died in 1881 when G.M. Weimer was only 24. And while it's not unusual for 24-year-olds to have children, it is really unusual for 24-year-olds to have two children who are old enough to be in college. Something is amiss if that has, or something very unusual has happened if that's the case. So it seems unlikely that Weimer would have been old enough to have two sons at Eureka and for him to be there for the same reason. Additionally, the last time that the Illinois State Convention was held before O'Kane died was in 1878, which moves the timeline back another 3 years. So Weimer would have been no older than 21 at the time of this possible meeting. And again, my goal here is not to question the credibility and the goodwill of ministers from past generations, but these stories just don't stand up to inquiry, unfortunately. I will say Lincoln's father and his stepmother, Thomas and Sarah, did become members of the disciples, but it was after Lincoln had moved out of the house. And Abraham was not at all close to his father and probably would not have seen him as much of an influence to be emulated. All right, now that I am done crushing everybody's hopes and dreams, we can get into the more positive building up side of this, which is that this Stone-Campbell Movement, Restoration Heritage, has also had an impact on the judiciary. Out of the 112 men and women who have served on the United States Supreme Court, 2 justices who actually overlapped on the court in 1915 were members of the Disciples of Christ. They were very different in temperament and time spent on the court, but Joseph Rucker Lamar, that name might sound familiar to the Restoration Movement minded among you, and James Clark McReynolds both reflected in their lives and legal careers the geographical, cultural, intellectual influences of our movement. The slightly younger of these 2 justices, the Georgian Joseph Rucker, or J.R. Lamar, was born on October 14, 1857, into a family which was distinguished politically and religiously. Joseph's father was the well-known minister and theologian J.S. Lamar, who served for many years in congregations in Georgia and is best remembered for publishing an influential theological work, the first somewhat systematic theology within the movement, the Organon of Scripture, 3 years after Joseph was born. And wouldn't it be great if all of us who write books could say that we wrote our best work while we've got a 3-year-old running around in the house? That bodes well for me this year. Another Lamar family member, Mirabeau, was the president of the Republic of Texas for 4 years. In fact, Joseph Lamar was not even the first Supreme Court justice from his own family. With his cousin Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar, and what other profession could you have besides Supreme Court justice with a name like that, holding a spot on the bench from 1888 to 1893. Still, even in this very accomplished family, Joseph was recognized as a special talent, and his father pushed him hard. He was steered to Bethany College of Alexander Campbell in 1875, and he finished his course of study there 2 years later. Along with knowledge, Joseph found romance during his undergraduate days. He fell in love with Clorinda Huntington Pendleton, who was the daughter of the school's president and the noted leader W.K. Pendleton. The couple married in early 1879, not long after Joseph was admitted to the Georgia bar, and started on his noteworthy career. Owing in large part to his exhaustive work in compiling the civil law volume for the state of Georgia all by himself, he was appointed to the state Supreme Court in 1903. But it was a chance encounter on the golf course rather than his accomplishments which led him to the highest court in the land. He was a golf enthusiast, and he happened to play around with the recently elected President William Howard Taft when Taft visited Augusta, Georgia, at the turn between 1908 and 1909. Apparently, Lamar impressed Taft with his golf playing and also his scholarly chops, and after another Supreme Court justice retired in 1910, J.R. Lamar was nominated to the court and began his term on January 3rd, 1911. Right out of the gate, he issued some of his most notable work. In fact, 2 of his 3 most important opinions were written during his first year on the court. The Oxford Companion to the Supreme Court of the United States writes that, quote, his noteworthy opinions were those that expanded administrative discretion for executive officials. In other words, trying to give the executive branch the opportunity to enforce, to put into practice the laws as it saw fit, kind of expanding the power of the bureaucracy. In a relatively famous court case, you might know the labor organizer Samuel Gompers. In Gompers versus Buckstoven Range, Lamar spoke for a unanimous court, which affirmed that the federal government could use injunctions to end boycotts. So not necessarily a super pro-labor move there. And also later that same year, in United States versus Grimaud, he upheld, there's no reason why you would know this, the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, but also gave the administrators a lot of leeway in determining which trees got cut down and which ones didn't, presumably. But his most significant contribution as a justice actually took him far from the court's chambers. Although he was appointed by Taft, Lamar was a childhood friend of Woodrow Wilson, who was elected to the presidency in 1912. So despite the partisan differences between Wilson and his predecessor Taft, again, they were of two different parties, Wilson appointed Lamar to serve on a committee which represented American interest at the ABC, Argentina, Brazil, Chile conference. This conference was brought about because Mexican military forces had been clashing with their civilian officials. This was a time period of incredible turmoil south of the border. The U.S. had tried to intervene at times to try to bolster the democratically elected Mexican government, but then the military steps in and the two countries were about to come to war, like full-out war with each other, and this conference was meant to try to mend fences. It did ultimately mostly achieve that goal. But while Lamar's diplomatic service was successful in reducing tensions between the countries, it left him in poor health and exhausted to start the court's term in 1915. But 1915 was also the year in which a second member of the Disciples of Christ, James Clark McReynolds, was appointed to the Supreme Court. McReynolds grew up in Elkton, Kentucky, where his father was a prominent surgeon and planter. Like Lamar, he was pushed hard by his very demanding father. He graduated as the valedictorian of Vanderbilt in 1882, and then from the law school at the University of Virginia 2 years later in 1884. He quickly made a name for himself on the Nashville legal scene and became a professor at Vanderbilt in 1900. He also tested the political waters, running as a gold Democrat for a congressional seat. He didn't win, but he drew enough support that it brought him to the attention of Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1903 asked him to serve as an assistant attorney general. From there, he moved to New York City and reestablished his career until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson brought him into his cabinet as attorney general. Now, let me just stop for a second. I want you to imagine the worst coworker you've ever had, someone who constantly doesn't get along with anybody, incredibly profane, foul-mouthed. Hopefully that doesn't apply to anyone who works here, right? But if you worked elsewhere, right, just the most difficult person, someone who is incredibly prejudiced, incredibly hateful. This helps explain Woodrow Wilson's behavior here. So Wilson brings him in as the attorney general. 1 year later, he asks him to serve on the Supreme Court instead. He's like, I can't fire this guy. He's going to cause too much of a problem. I can't have him in my cabinet. He's going to cause too much of a problem. Fortunately for Wilson, a Supreme Court justice dies, and he's like, great, I can send him over across the road here, and nobody will be any wiser. Now, McReynolds was qualified to be Attorney General and to be, from a academic standpoint at least, the Supreme Court justice. But his entry in the Tennessee Encyclopedia reads that his, quote, violent temper and abrasive personality soon began to create problems for the president. And that continued when he was on the court. Now, McReynolds' trademark writing style, very blunt, very acerbic, was evident from the start, as shown in his very first opinion. In fact, his biographer observes that, quote, McReynolds' maiden opinion is remarkable because it reflects certain peculiar characteristics that typified all his 503 opinions for the court and mirrored his character as well. It's short, he cites only 4 authorities, keeps the language plain and unadorned, and mostly just calls it like he sees it. But while some readers might have wanted more explanation from McReynolds, he fit well on the court in terms of his politics, and likely most of his colleagues would not have wanted any more clarification. They would have agreed with him. Now, the brief professional working relationship between Lamar and McReynolds doesn't seem to have been an overly close one. But it is clear that they shared much in terms of their judicial philosophies and their approaches to writing. Lamar's writing style was similarly very plain. He attempted to decide a case as a matter of right and wrong rather than getting bogged down in too many technicalities. I'm not sure how good of a decision-making process that is for a Supreme Court justice, but that was the approach. And Lamar's 1915 opinion in U.S. versus Midwest Oil Company was among his most significant. It expanded executive discretion and power. McReynolds didn't take part in that decision or in any of the other opinions that Lamar wrote while they were on the court together, but he also offered no dissent. In other words, he didn't vote against. They were on the same side in each of the cases where they were both involved. The one time where one of them referred directly to the other, McReynolds approvingly cited one of Lamar's previous cases. But the brief window during which the disciples of Christ were very represented, 2 out of 9, on the Supreme Court closed in September 1915, when Joseph Rucker Lamar suffered a paralytic stroke and was unable to begin the new term. Again, as I mentioned a minute ago, he was already in poor health before the stroke. He lingered for a few months, but ended up passing away at his home in Washington on January 2nd of 1916. His body was taken back to Augusta. 2 days later, he was buried on the 5th. So, again, a very short, much more pleasant person, but a much shorter stay on the court. But brevity and affability would not be accurately describing the court's other disciple. Now, this quote comes from McReynolds' biographer, right? Someone who's trying to give him the most sympathetic treatment. He says, had McReynolds resigned from the bench in the early 20s or retired at the end of that decade, his name would barely survive. He would be recalled, if at all, as one of a dozen or so competent but undistinguished justices who labored with their more brilliant brethren to maintain the generally conservative mien of the court. But McReynolds stayed on until 1945. Now, before we get into the negative side here, in 1925, McReynolds did offer some notable opinions related to individual civil liberties, the relationship between church and state and religious education, some decisions that actually impact families in church schools today. But he was far better known for being incredibly difficult to work with. A major component of this was his very avowed anti-Semitism. He was not collegial toward his colleague Benjamin Cardozo, and, quote, at one time actually left the conference room whenever Louis Brandeis spoke. The two justices apparently were never on speaking terms, even though they were appointed by the same president. But in terms of his judicial philosophy, McReynolds was numbered, along with George Sutherland, Willis Devanter, and Pierce Butler, among the Four Horsemen, or the Battalion of Death. Some really great names there, who opposed the New Deal at every turn. These were the justices that almost led to the expansion of the court under FDR, and then famously, when the Supreme Court's Chief Justice started to vote some more in favor of some of the New Deal legislation, it was the switch in time that saved 9. But again, especially in the years between 1935 and 1937, these four voted as a block, and as long as they had one other vote, they could basically veto right anything that Roosevelt and the Congress had tried to put forward. But personnel changes led to McReynolds winding up on the losing side of the argument, at least in terms of votes. Van Devanter and Sutherland retired in 1938. Butler followed in 1940. So of the horsemen of the Battalion of Death, only McReynolds remained, and while he remained as strongly anti-New Deal as ever, he found himself out of step with his colleagues and unable to stop the legislation he disapproved of. And even though he had allegedly vowed that he would never resign as long as that crippled something is in the White House, I have edited there for public consumption, he slipped out of his robe in 1945 and retired. 5 years later, the justice contracted bronchial pneumonia, died, and was buried in his hometown of Elkton, Kentucky. But only after his death was it revealed that he had been single-handedly supporting 33 English refugees who had been impacted by German bombing in 1941. Interesting guy. Now, the Lamar-McReynolds pairing could not and should not be considered one of the all-time great judicial alliances. I only went to law school for 3 months, and I can tell you that that's the case, right? It does not take a great legal mind to say that this is not the most important judicial era for the court. One of the justices, Lamar, is mostly forgotten, and the other, to the extent that McReynolds is remembered, it's mostly for his anti-Semitism and being a pain to work with. But still, despite their shortcomings, despite their, at times, very difficult personalities, the fact that the two men were on the court together helps show the increased prominence of the Stone-Campbell heritage, and especially of the disciples of Christ on the national political stage. Because he was the son of J.S. Lamar and the son-in-law of W.K. Pendleton, J.R. Lamar was basically movement royalty. He served as a trustee for his father's congregation in Augusta and even spoke there on occasion, though he was terribly afraid of having to pray. His wife had to remind him how to do that in front of an audience, and he was just like, just don't get me up here. McReynolds, his father, was just as devoted to the movement, and in fact, he actually single-handedly paid the salary of the minister of the Elkton congregation for a period of time. McReynolds, the justice, included the National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C. in his will. Whatever we might think about their personalities and about the people individually, I think their brief window of shared responsibility on the court, as well as the broader political engagement of the Stone-Campbell movement that we talked about at the beginning today, can serve as a jumping-off point for further exploration of the political and legal impacts of the Stone-Campbell movement, of the connections between these individuals, and about the role that politics could, should, couldn't, shouldn't play in our lives today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for that presentation. And as Brad said in the beginning, we thank all of our distinguished guests for being here this morning. And anytime you have an opportunity to be with us at Heritage, please feel free to stop by. Just a few brief announcements this morning for our students. September the 23rd is the Radiant presentation, so remember that, ladies. That is 6 to 8. And if you have any questions, please see any of our Radiant ladies. Next week is midterms, specifically for this section. Remember, next week is midterms, so be preparing for that. This Saturday of the 21st, ministry opportunity for our students. The Church of Christ at Iuka will be having a door-knocking campaign from 9 to 12, and they will serve breakfast and lunch. If any student is interested in this, please see me. Also, for our legacy students, I have composed a list of departments who are willing to help you out with your legacy hours. So if you are needing any assistance with that, again, please contact me. Today after chapel, in the cafeteria will be the gender reveal for baby McFerrin. So for our guests, many of us are wearing pink or blue. So we look forward to that in the cafeteria. Today is Caleb Simpson's birthday. So if you see Simpson, please wish him a happy birthday. On the 19th, that is this Thursday, the SGA will be hosting a Logos training from 4:30 to 5:30, and dinner will be afterwards. That is all the announcements that I have this morning. You are dismissed.